Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this Stride workshop, recognising and responding to domestic abuse. This is part of our Staying In Together programme at Positive East. We've got a very special guest speaker tonight. Matthew has worked for the LGBT anti-violence charity Galop for over 3 years now. He's currently an independent domestic violence advisor supporting LGBT victims and survivors of domestic abuse. Prior to working at Galop, Matthew worked here at Positive East for over 8 years. Matthew, welcome. It's great to have you with us tonight.
Thank you very much. So yeah, it's brilliant to be with Positive East. So my role at Galop, as Greg said, is I support victims and survivors of domestic abuse. So if we bring up the slides, Greg, I can talk a bit about Galop to begin with.
Sure.
Great. So as I said, I work for Galop, and Galop was actually formed in 1982. And the Galop is short for Gay London Policing Monitoring Group. And it was back then, it was a group of LGBT lawyers who were really concerned about the amount of hate crime our community were being subjected to, but also how badly we were being treated by the police at the time. And actually later on in the 1980s, it wasn't uncommon for police officers, if they were going to an address of a gay person, they would often wear spacesuits because they were actually frightened of getting HIV and AIDS. So thankfully, we've come on a long way since then. We've still got more work to do, but things are much better now than they were. So currently, Galop is an LGBT anti-violence charity supporting people who have experienced hate crime, sexual violence, or domestic abuse. And we also have specialist young people's workers and also a trans advocacy worker. So next slide, please, Greg. So here are some statistics about LGBT people in the UK and domestic abuse. So firstly, according to research gathered by Stonewall and YouGov, 11% of all LGBT people across England and Wales have experienced domestic abuse in 2018, and compared to only 4.5% of the general population. So already we can see that LGBT people are twice as likely to experience domestic abuse than the general population. And a recent report found by Gallup also found that 1 in 4 gay men or lesbian women have experienced at least one form of domestic abuse since the age of 16. There hasn't been as much research for trans people, but a report by the Scottish Transgender Alliance indicates that as many as 80% of trans people have experienced emotional, sexual, physical abuse from a current or former intimate partner. Next slide, please, Greg. So what is domestic abuse? So domestic abuse is any kind of threatening behaviour, violence or abuse between people who have been intimate partners or close family members. And this also includes forced marriage, abuse relating to gender identity, sexuality, or so-called honour-based violence. So if we think of so-called honour-based violence for LGBT people, this is usually when family members find out that a member of their family is lesbian, gay, bisexual or trans, and they feel that being LGBT is wrong, it's not in keeping with their culture or their faith, and they will then perpetrate violence and abuse towards that family member on the grounds of their sexuality or gender identity. And that could be because they're trying to correct that person's behaviour, or they are just perpetrating abuse for that person, in their mind, bringing shame and dishonour on the family. And so-called honour-based violence is not just about being LGBT. It could be something like someone walking down the road, smoking a cigarette. It could be the clothes that someone wears may be deemed to be inappropriate. It may be a female that has a baby outside of wedlock. It might be someone finding out that somebody has had sex outside of marriage, or that perhaps someone refuses to marry someone that the family have arranged for them to marry, or simply that someone has just decided to stop practicing the religion that they were born into. Anything essentially that a family believed that someone is bringing shame and dishonor on their family and culture. And domestic abuse can take many forms, including psychological, physical, sexual, financial, and emotional abuse. Next slide, please, Greg. So what does increase the risk of domestic abuse for LGBT people? So we know that some people not being able to be open about their relationship. So if people are perhaps not, if someone can't tell their friends or family members that they're LGBT because of risk of being disowned, or being rejected, they can't then just go to their friends and family members for help if they're experiencing domestic abuse because their family do not know this relationship exists. Fear of dishonoring their own community. So perhaps people have experienced homophobia, biphobia, or transphobia from their family, and they're frightened to then turn around to their family and tell them that their partner is being abusive towards them, because they're frightened perhaps that the family will just say, well, you're a gay man, what do you expect? You're in a relationship with a man, that's not normal. If you're in a relationship with a woman, this wouldn't be happening to you. And of course, that's not true. An increased risk of honor-based violence. So perhaps people are fearful of going to the police or health agencies or services in general because they're just absolutely petrified of the idea of their family or community finding out that they're LGBT. Some professionals only recognising female cisgender victim survivors. So I know with some of my clients, they talk about when the police have come to their house. And I know that in some cases, if the victim survivor had been female and their partner had been male, they would have most probably taken the female victim survivor to one side and spoke to them independently and made sure they were okay, and probably carry out the sort of Safe Lives risk assessment, which is the general risk assessment all professionals use to assess the level of risk. But because it was two people of the same sex, that the police are perhaps looking at it as a dispute, as opposed to recognising the domestic violence. And again, there was a case where one gay man went to hospital and he was with his boyfriend, who was the person that had attacked him and caused the injury that he was in hospital for. And again, if that victim survivor had been female, the medical staff would have probably insisted on talking to that female on her own and asking her how this injury had occurred. But because it was two men together, that never came into the medical professional's mind. According to the Mental Health Foundation, members of the LGBT community are more likely to experience a range of mental health problems. And poorer mental health could be attributed to a range of factors, including discrimination, isolation, homophobia, biphobia, or transphobia. And certainly if people do have mental health problems, there is lots of statistics there and information to sort of show that people with mental health problems are more vulnerable to domestic abuse. The next thing is an increase of chems use, sometimes referred to as chemsex, and I'll go into that in more detail a bit later on. Prejudice or misunderstanding towards trans people. So I was talking to some police officers once, and they just assumed that my client, who was trans female, was less vulnerable, because in their mind they were looking at this person who had been born male and was potentially stronger and more able to defend themselves, where in actual fact, if someone identifies as female, they're automatically more vulnerable to domestic violence. And certainly, as we saw from the statistics earlier, trans female people are much more likely to experience domestic abuse and violence, unfortunately, than cisgender female people. Spousal visas, so fear of being returned to a country that is unsafe for LGBT people. So some of my clients have come to me and they've said that their husband has said to them that if they leave them, or they report them to the police, or they try and end this marriage, they're going to go to the Home Office and try and get my client removed from the UK. So if that is the case, we have to act quickly. So what we would do is we would, as a matter of priority, is link that person into an immigration solicitor. And one option would be to apply for what is known as a DDV concession, and that is a destitute domestic violence concession. And that gives someone 3 months where the Home Office will leave them alone. They will be able to access public funds. And in that period, what the immigration solicitor would do is apply for indefinite leave to, an emergency indefinite leave to remain on the basis that they are fleeing domestic violence. And even if the DDV concession, they're not able to get that, they can still apply for the emergency indefinite leave to remain. And my job as an advocate would be to get these kind of supporting information. So I would write a supporting letter myself, and I'd work with the police and other agencies to get the immigration solicitor everything they needed in order to, so they could put forward their case to the Home Office. Finally, we have fear of having other personal information exposed, and that could be drug use, living with HIV, pictures and film clips. So I have had some of my clients say to me that if they leave their partner has threatened to go on social media and tell the whole world that they are HIV positive, and that including their friends and family members. Or they threaten to put pictures or videos of the two of them having sex together or using drugs together, or perhaps, yeah. And in those cases, so what we would do is I would encourage my clients to apply for what is called a non-molestation order, which is a civil injunction. It's a protection order. And what that does, as a non-molestation order, once it's in place, it prevents the perpetrator from contacting the victim survivor. They're not allowed to contact them by phone or any other means, or cause them any kind of abuse or harassment, or get other people to cause them abuse or harm or harassment in any way. But if they had a non-molestation order against them, and they then went and posted the victim survivor's HIV status on social media, they are breaching the non-molestation order, because that would be classed as being abusive and causing harassment and harm to that victim survivor. And a breach of a non-molestation order is punishable by up to 5 years in prison. So normally when the order is in place, that is enough to stop the perpetrator from carrying out their threats. And if they do, then the victim survivor will call the police, and that perpetrator will be arrested and potentially charged. And the non-molestation order is also a good way of protecting people whose immigration status is at risk. So again, if a perpetrator with a non-molestation order against them then went to the Home Office and made attempts to get the victim survivor removed from the UK, again, that is causing harassment and potential harm to that victim survivor. So by law, they're breaching the non-molestation order. Okay, next slide, Greg. So what is chemsex? So I know that many people know what chemsex is, but we'll just recap it anyway. So the first paragraph is from the Antidote London Friend website, saying that chemsex can simply be defined as sexual activity, mostly between men, while under the influence of drugs, often taking place with one or multiple sexual partners. But in terms of our work at Galop at supporting victim survivors of domestic abuse, we've seen an increased amount of chems use within both domestic abuse same-sex relationships, but also heterosexual relationships where the female is trans. And we know that the three main drugs associated with chemsex or chems use are crystal meth, methadone, or G. And at the bottom, we can also see that other drugs are sometimes used, cocaine, ketamine, and ecstasy. But in terms of domestic abuse, we tend to use the word chems use, because when we think of chemsex, we perhaps have this image of a group of people at a sex party where the kind of relationships are more casual, or perhaps people, some people who are having the sexual exchanges haven't met each other. But in terms of domestic abuse, of course, we're looking at established intimate partnerships, which is why we tend to say chems use. Thank you, Greg. Next slide. So what are the additional risk factors when chems are present in a relationship? So the first one is fear of chems use disclosure. So I had a client last year who was actually a registered therapist, and he had used crystal meth at least 2 or 3 times with his ex-partner. But his partner had been very violent and abusive to him, so he fled the relationship. And his partner was a very heavy chems user and was frequently perpetrating violence and abuse. But my client was really keen to report his ex-partner to the police because there was still a lot of ongoing abuse and harassment. And I told my client that unfortunately, if the ex-partner made counter allegations and disclosed the fact that my client had used crystal meth with him, that if the police were given that information, there's a possibility that the police then may feel obligated to inform my client's employers because my client is working with vulnerable people. And that would, you know, my client may have potentially lost their job, their registration would certainly be at risk, and that could potentially affect their whole career. So we discussed this at length, and my client decided not to report to the police on that basis. Drug-induced comas, and that can be when a victim survivor themselves ODs on drugs that they've taken, or perhaps the perpetrator drugs them on purpose and puts them into a drug-induced coma. And if that happens, unfortunately, we also see an increased risk of sexual assault. An increased risk of violent and abusive behaviour. So for some of my clients, they've actually said to me that prior to their partner's chems use, there was no violence or abuse in the relationship whatsoever. And it's only since the partner has been using chems, all of a sudden, their partner has started perpetrating numerous and frequent incidences of extreme acts of violence towards them. And that's obviously very frightening. It's harder to distinguish who is the primary aggressor and who is the primary victim survivor. And in all cases of domestic violence, there's nearly always a primary aggressor and a primary victim survivor. But if both people are using chems, what we can see sometimes is an increased risk of situational couple violence. And situational couple violence is essentially when a couple have a disagreement, which then escalates into an argument, which then escalates towards verbal aggression, and then escalates to an incident of violence. Violence and abuse experience not being believed or acknowledged due to the victim survivor's chems use. So I have had cases where clients have come to me, they've called the police because of they've been attacked by their partner, but the police haven't taken any action because my client, they were using chems at the time and they weren't able to articulate themselves as to what had actually happened to them. So what I've done then is I've supported them to re-report to the police, and at a time when they're sober and they're able to articulate what they experienced far more clearly. A person with problematic chems use may not be classed as a credible witness in court. Now, if someone reports domestic violence to the police and the police feel they have enough evidence to take it further, it will then get passed on to the Crown Prosecution Service, who will then make a decision as to whether or not a case can go to court. And usually, if a domestic violence case goes to court, it's usually the victim survivor who is the primary witness in court. Their questioning and what that victim survivor provides the court is usually the deciding factor as to whether or not the judge has enough evidence to charge the perpetrator. Unfortunately, if the perpetrator is aware that the victim survivor is using chems or has used chems, the defence will use that against them, and they will use that to try and discredit the victim survivor as a credible witness. But what I've done in those cases, I had 2 cases last year that were very high risk, and both the victim survivors were heavy chems users. And what I did with both of them was to support them to get a non-molestation order in place, which is the civil injunction that I talked about earlier. And that just meant that automatically, once that was in place, the perpetrator had to leave them alone. And if they didn't, they would risk going to prison. And that just prevented my clients in that situation from having to be dragged through court and potentially have their own drug use kind of picked to pieces and pulled apart. And finally, we have, it can be a barrier to accessing refuge. Now, most of the refuges for victims of domestic violence and abuse are for women, but there are some very good male refuges as well. And there are at least 3 LGBT specific refuges in the UK at the moment. But unfortunately, if people are using chems, I mean, it depends on the circumstances, but certainly if the chems use is potentially problematic, or perhaps the victim survivor is not in a kind of program to kind of stop them from using chems, the chances are most refuges will not accept them on that basis. So next slide, please. So what support do we at Galop provide LGBT victim survivors of domestic abuse? So we run the National LGBT Domestic Abuse Helpline, and that's open 5 days a week between 10 and 5 o'clock, but Wednesdays and Thursdays it's open till 8 o'clock, and people can call that completely confidentially. They don't have to give their real name. So if anyone is concerned about anything going on within a family or a relationship, please do give us a call. And also, if you're worried about a friend or family member, you can contact us for help and advice as well. So we also have caseworkers like myself that provide advocacy, practical and emotional support. MARIC referrals. So when we assess a case, after we carry out assessment, if we feel it's a high risk situation, we refer to MARIC, which is a multi-agency risk assessment conference. And every local authority across London and the UK will have these MARIC meetings at least once a month. And at these meetings, if it's one of my cases, I will be there to be the voice of my client, but you also have the police, social services, mental health services, local drug and alcohol services, housing, all the sort of core agencies really, and between us we will put a risk assessment together to help keep our clients safe and support them in whatever way the client wants in order to get to a safer point. Housing advocacy. So I would say on average I probably help 2 to 4 people every month find alternative accommodation. So most of the housing advocacy we do ourselves, but if some cases become a bit more complicated, we'll bring in a solicitor, or we may refer to our partner agency, Stonewall Housing. Access to refuges, I mentioned that earlier. So the LGBT refugees always contact us to let us know when they've got spaces, and that, you know, but we will sort of seek out which refugees do have spaces if one of our clients needs to flee quickly. Police, the Criminal Justice Service, so we would never, we would only support our clients to go to the police if that's what they wanted. Some people are totally dead against getting police involved. And we never force our clients to do anything against their wishes. But certainly if people do want to report to the police, we can support them through that process. But also if there's a current police investigation going on, sometimes the officer in charge will contact me for one of my clients, and we'll talk not just about the criminal investigation, but we'll talk about things that need to be done generally in order to keep my clients safe and to help them move forward. Civil injunctions, I've already talked about the non-molestation orders, but if a couple actually have a joint tenancy or they perhaps jointly own a property, when we support our clients to do the non-molestation order, we would also put in for an occupation order as well. So if the non-molestation order is granted, the judge will then make a decision whether or not to grant the occupation order. And in most cases they do. And once that order is granted, that essentially bars, that excludes the perpetrator from the property. And an occupation order is only a temporary solution until a permanent solution can be sought. So they normally last for 6 months, but within those 6 months, if it's a joint tenancy, the victim survivor can then go to their landlord, whether it be a social landlord or a private landlord, and ask for the tenancy to be changed to a sole occupancy tenancy. If it's a jointly owned property, what the judge would expect to happen within those 6 months is, obviously through their, both parties would then have solicitors involved, and they would look at either selling the property and dividing the assets, or perhaps the victim survivor may offer to buy the perpetrator out, and they kind of negotiate some kind of financial settlement. But all that would be done through the solicitors, because with the non-molestation order in place, the perpetrator would not be able to have direct contact with the victim survivor. Advocacy, so accessing policies and rights within all health and statutory services, including immigration rights. And I think, there is a kind of misconception that domestic violence is a police issue, but in actual fact, all agencies need to play their part. And I had one disabled client, and I really needed the care coordinator to get on board in order to help find my client emergency accommodation, because it wasn't like my other clients that any emergency accommodation was suitable. Anything that we found had to mean that the care package was transferred to wherever they moved to, and the other accommodation properly assessed in terms of suitability. And that particular care coordinator kept saying to me, but I've told her to call the police and she's not going to do that. And I said, well, she doesn't want to do that. She wants to flee. So you need to work with me in order to help make that happen. And eventually she got on board. Clare's Law. So in 2009, Claire Wood was murdered by her boyfriend. And after her death, her father found out that this particular boyfriend had a string of criminal convictions for domestic violence against other women. And Claire's father spoke out publicly and said, if the police had told my daughter Claire that this man had carried out these acts of violence on other women, my daughter would most probably have left this person and she'd still be alive today. So he was then approached by a domestic violence agency, and between them they fought to create Clare's Law, and it was launched in 2014. And what that means is, if someone is worried about their intimate partner and they're experiencing abuse within a relationship, they can make a Clare's Law application. And you can do that online. You can actually go to the Metropolitan Police website and fill in a Clare's Law application online, and within 35 days, the police will then come back to the victim survivor. And if they find something of significance, they will meet with the victim survivor. I mean, it's done on a kind of need to know basis. So they wouldn't give the details of other victim survivors. But if it was me, for example, and I'd made the application, they may come to me and say, Matthew, we've looked at this, and what we discovered was your partner has 2 criminal convictions against former partners for domestic violence. And there have been at least 3 other people who've made similar allegations to the police as yourself. And with that information, it gives the victim survivor, they're able to make an informed choice about what they want to do in order to potentially leave that relationship or make their situation safer. Safety planning, that's really important. That's a major part of our work. So we look at all the kind of the long-term goals. And, you know, we kind of like, someone may want a non-molestation order, for example, but they don't want to do it until they've got alternative accommodation. So the order would be about ensuring the perpetrator doesn't try and follow them, and the victim survivor is free to try and get on with their lives. But then we have to kind of think of the short-term planning as well. So I would encourage my clients to think about confiding in one of their friends and family members, and having an agreement that if they just have to pick up their things and run, that they can go to this person's house, and that person, you know, find someone they can trust that will take them in an emergency, and may even sort of think about, you know, keeping a few clothes at that person's house and a bit of cash, and maybe some essential items like their passport and what have you. So if they literally just have to run out the door and run, they can, and they've got somewhere safe that they can go. And other things like maybe keeping an emergency bag in the house. So a bag that's hidden away, that's got a bit of money, maybe even a spare pay-as-you-go phone and a bit of money, like their sort of essential documents. Again, they can just grab that and run if needed. And then finally, we have the sanctuary scheme referral. So every local authority across every London borough has a sanctuary scheme. And what that does, if I had a flat and I had split up with my partner, but my ex-partner knew where I lived, and I was fearful that the ex-partner may try and break into my home, I would make the sanctuary scheme referral as I would do that for my client. And then they would go and assess my client's home, and they would look at doing things like maybe changing the front door, putting extra locks on the door, locks and alarms on the windows, and in some cases even putting what's called a safe room in. So the victim survivor can just run into a room, lock themselves in, only they have the number code in order to let themselves out. And there might be a phone in that room as well that the victim survivor can call the police if needed. So the next slide, please, Greg. So if anybody has any concerns about domestic abuse, whether it's about yourselves or friends and family members, please do call us at Galop. There's the details for our helpline at the top. If anyone is looking at this and they're worried about abuse they may be causing a partner or ex-partner or family member, you can contact Respect. And Respect is there to support people who are perpetrating abuse onto others, and they're worried about their own, what's going on, and they want to get help for themselves, and they want to try and put a stop to this. And if you're not sure which organisation to contact, you can contact the Respect helpline, because they support both male victim survivors of abuse as well as perpetrators. And that brings me to the end of the presentation.